Hello, everyone. I am Jacob with Revolve Engineering. We focus on net zero buildings, energy modeling, and geothermal system design. And over the last 15, 18 years, we've been lucky enough to work on some pretty fun buildings. So just wanted to share some of those stories so that you can implement some of these strategies on your own. But unfortunately, I am going to have to start with the depressing intro because I'm not here to just show you a technology. I kind of want to change the way you see the world. But don't worry, I'm not going to show you depressing pictures of drowning polar bears or 1 in 500 year storms that hit Mozambique, two of them within a span of 6 weeks that displaced 3 million people, or the wildfires that have been ravaging our summers every year, or the epic droughts in India that were visible from space, or the epic droughts in Central America, or the Horn of Africa, which left 15 million people without food, or the historic droughts in Alberta, where I am. We had 51 water advisory last year, and some cities were trucking in water. Or the epic storms in Florida, or the epic flooding in Europe or Nepal last year. I definitely don't want to show you pictures of the Jasper wildfire. Sometimes it's easy to remove yourself from these disasters because it's happening far away, but the closer it comes to your home, the more real it is. And we still don't really have a feeling of what it is like to stand in front of your own burned out house. And I wish this was just about the climate disasters, but the reality is that entire ecosystems are collapsing. We've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We are pushing our planet literally to the brink. We're already in the 6th mass extinction event. 50% of species will be extinct by 2050. We've lost half the world's trees, 85% of wetlands, 40% of insects, 90% of global fish stocks are depleted, 50% of coral reefs, 40% of the world's classes of land is classified as degraded. How are we going to grow food when we can't, when our land is so degraded? We have pesticides, herbicides, and plastic pollution polluting every single waterway in the world. And we're ourselves are littered with forever chemicals and plastics. And this isn't just due to ignorance or lack of concerns. This is due to structural features of our capitalist economy. But hey, the good news is the 300 richest people on the planet who already own 60% of the world's wealth are getting richer and richer every year. The amount of people that can fit on an airplane own more than half the world's wealth. And we don't ask ourselves, they're lies, that we need to keep growing, the perpetual growth on a finite planet. Is that a stupid idea? Think about it this way. We are doing all of this damage, not to improve our lives or do anything, but to make sure that a very tiny, tiny minority keeps seeing profits every year. And we have forgotten one very important thing. Humans cannot survive without a healthy ecosystem. It is a healthy ecosystem that sustains societies, that create economies. It does not work the other way around. We are intrinsically tied to nature. Our health is intrinsically tied to nature. And if the natural world is suffering, then we suffer. And I know that might make you sad. Honestly, I've been struggling with ecological grief for the last 2 years at least. But I don't want you to get sad. I want you to get angry. Because anger is the most compassionate response we can have to experiencing or witnessing injustice. And it can be a powerful catalyst for change. So don't internalize it. We need to transform that anger to something life-giving, courage, love, change, compassion, and justice, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But the whole thing, I'm trying to give you some context that we have to look at everything we're about to talk about in the context of climate change. We saw how drastically COVID changed our lives overnight. Climate change is going to make that look like a bad cold. And if you're operating from the assumptions of the old world and you're building buildings with those assumptions, then you have a fundamental blind spot. And it all starts with this carbon budget and the target. We're trying to get to this 1.5-degree target. And this carbon budget, which Edmonton, where I am, agreed to this target when we hosted the IPCC conference in 2019, our share of that is 155 megatons. The intent is for the world to try to hit 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, that 1.5 degrees is already gone. But we have to remind ourselves that the difference between 2 degrees and 3 degrees is hundreds of millions of lives. And past 3 degrees, honestly, organized human civilization might not survive. I don't know if you've been seeing the screaming and the pleas from all the climate scientists. We are pushing past the brink. And so just to give you an idea, Edmonton did some great modeling to show what this would look like, to try to stay within this 1.5 degree target. Basically, by 2023, which was 2 years ago, we would have had to reach a 30% reduction in emissions from our baseline year. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. And by 2030, we would need an 80% emissions reduction. That's staggering. It's crazy how rapid that is. And every year we delay, that drop needs to happen quicker. So why am I bringing this up? Imagine you're building a building today and you finish construction in 2025. You're hoping that this building lasts for at least 50 years, right? That means the life of the building is until 2075. You can probably see where I'm going with this, but the world needs to be off fossil fuels by 2050. By 2030, we have to have an 80% emissions reduction, and the Pan-Canadian framework says that all new buildings have to be net zero already. You don't have a lot of time left in this building. The majority of your life of the building, you're not going to be allowed to, or you won't want to use fossil fuels. And in the next 5 years, there's going to be tons of pressure and tons of things that could happen that will make that you wanting to use fossil fuel-based system even less likely. Now, the first one is a spike in natural gas prices. And I know a lot of people don't think about this because natural gas prices have been essentially free for the last 10 or 15 years. But the reality is that every single shale play almost in North America has peaked production. They're flatlining. Alberta peaked a while ago. Meanwhile, consumption keeps going up because we're switching coal-fired plants to natural gas and we're building more homes, more buildings. So consumption's going up. And now they're building all these LNG terminals, which don't get me started on how idiotic LNG is to freeze, to liquefy natural gas and to ship it over there. They use about a third of the natural gas just to ship it over there. But anyways, we're no longer an island in North America. They're trying to export this to try to get to the higher energy prices. This alone could triple natural gas prices. But so we're using more and more, and we're producing less and less. And this is what they're struggling to keep up because fracking wells have really high decline rates. They produce really well first few years and then they fall off a cliff. And every ounce of natural gas you use, you need to find a new source for. And so depending on which year, EIA actually just came out today because of the pressure from the US, they changed their outlook saying that oil demand is going to keep going up till 2050. But they are forecasting drops in production. And the only reason we've seen natural gas's price stay low is because of associated gas. And associated gas is the natural gas that comes along with oil well drilling. Because you can see the traditional plays have either declined or are flat, but associated gas has made up the difference. But 4 years ago, I don't know if you remember, when oil prices went down and they stopped drilling, natural gas prices spiked because of that associated gas disappeared. And in Europe, those prices went up to $50, $40 gigajoule. People were choosing whether to heat their homes or cook a meal. And I'm not saying I know what's going to happen with natural gas prices. It's in this market, it's impossible to get good information. But what I am saying is if you expect the next 10 years, 15 years to follow the path of the last 15 years, I think you'll be in for a big shock. So that's the first thing. And before we get off natural gas, let's deal with this a little bit because natural gas is methane. Natural gas is the marketing name, right? They're just like very pretty. There's nothing natural about it. If we look at the natural gas, they talk about how clean burning it is and how it's a transition fuel. We take 100 kilograms of natural gas extracted. They use some of it as fuel gas. Some of it is vented and leaked. And that's a big problem because methane is 80 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2. So any leaks have a huge impact. So you get about 86 kilograms of natural gas in your home, and it's relatively clean burning at 0.19 kilograms per kilowatt hour. So you have 236 kilograms of downstream emissions. What nobody ever mentions is that the downstream emissions, because of the methane leaks, are almost the same. 50% of your emissions are upstream. Nobody accounts for this. The city of Edmonton is just starting to account for this now, but nobody else is accounting for these emissions. And these are based on literally the lowest industry estimates of the methane emissions. The reality is these emissions, upstream emissions, are likely 5 to 12 times higher. And this is why shale gas, where we get even low estimates, are higher in emissions than coal. Methane is dirtier than coal. That's the reality. And I know the industry is going to say, but we're getting methane emissions under control. Then why does every single study that come out show that their estimates are so underreported? They actually did flyovers over Alberta, and they found that actual emissions are 5 to 18 times higher than what they're reporting. How are they going to get methane emissions under control when they don't even know where they're coming from? And a recent UN report came out that 90% of these leaks have gone completely ignored. We know coal is dirty energy. It's time we look at methane the same way, because it's even worse. It's an environmental disaster. All of these leaks, these super emitters, are responsible for about 25% of the world's heating. Each fracking well requires 8 to 40 million liters of water. In the midst of a water crisis and droughts in BC and Alberta, there's thousands of wells being drilled with billions of liters of water being used. Then they add toxins to it and put it back in our waterways. 10% of the chemicals used in fracking fluids are toxic to human and aquatic health. And then you get the fun stuff like earthquakes and abandoned wells. I think the 8,000 is just oil wells. There's hundreds of thousands of fracking wells. This devastation is beyond scale. And then there's, of course, the air pollution, the VOCs, the particulates, habitat destruction, all the flaring that happens, which destroys our air quality. And we have to remember that each home that uses a boiler is just a flare stack. Yes, we're using the heat, but we're sending all those pollutants into the air we breathe. I'll pose the question, is installing methane in buildings even ethical? I'll let you ponder that. So I don't think it's unreasonable that pretty soon you're going to have a ban on natural gas in new buildings. And before you say that I'm crazy, realize that Vancouver, Montreal, Nanaimo, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Denver have already instituted such bans. As the world burns, policy pressure to do something about it is going to increase. Meanwhile, renewable energy costs keep dropping. Wind and solar are already the cheapest forms of energy generation. They're going to keep getting cheaper every single year. Which one are you going to bet your money on? And that's what I'm trying to say, is we've reached the tipping point of what is considered risky. If you don't realize how climate change is going to impact every single aspect of how you run your buildings, of how you operate your businesses, then you might not survive. You can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Because these are real costs. Insurance losses are now in the billions when they used to be in hundreds of thousands. Alberta is the disaster capital of Canada. 8 of the costliest disasters have happened in the last 12 years, and they're going to keep going. And that's what I'm trying to say. To install fossil fuel infrastructure now because of temporarily low natural gas prices is a fool's errand. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when you'll have to rip out that infrastructure. You'd basically be installing a stranded asset. Because all technological adoptions, and this is what it is, a technological adoption follows S-curves. And the experts are horrible in their forecasts. Every technological adoption follows an S-curve, from TVs to cars to radios to telephones. And PV and geosystems and EVs, they're all going to follow the same pattern. So I think that the S-curve for net zero buildings is going to look like this. Partly because by code, we already have to do that. And so do you really want to be the person that installs a stranded asset with fossil fuel infrastructure right before they become extinct. So how do we do it? How do we get to these higher energy targets and net zero buildings? Most people, when they think of green buildings, they think of passive approaches, adding insulation, having good windows. And certainly most first attempts in Edmonton, which is where I am, were very passive approaches to net zero. And the whole point is to reduce that space heating demand. So the walls were like 16-inch walls, double stud, R50 in the walls, R100 roofs, triple pane, quad pane windows, super airtight, ERVs. The whole point is to get that energy demand as low as possible. But is this practical for renovations, especially? Do you expect people to move out of their homes while we install a 16-inch wall and you lose space? How do you install insulation in the floor? It's not as easy as just slapping insulation. There's embodied carbon cost, there's construction cost. You have to have trades to know how to do it. You can't just slap insulation because your dew point's going to change. You might get condensation in the wall. So there's some practical challenges. So if not passive, then what? Well, let's compare the two approaches. Let's take a typical home built in North America. This is going to be in Alberta. So we're going to have a typical 2x6 wall with R20 bat, and accounting for the studs, that's about R16, R17 effective. The basement walls, typical R20 bat, R40 roof, dual pane windows, typical air infiltration, so like your leakiness, a typical quote unquote high efficiency furnace, no energy recovery ventilator for the fresh air, typical hot water tank, and your plug load is about 5,000 a year. So 15% of that energy is electricity. The rest is for natural gas for heating and space heating and hot water. I've estimated based on a roof area that I can fit about 12 kilowatts of PV on this roof. So our energy budget's about 13,000 kilowatt hours. So let's try to get there. The base case, currently the building uses 41,000 kilowatt hours or 41 megawatt hours of energy. 85% of that is natural gas. Again, that's our standard construction. So let's improve the air tightness to 1 air change per hour. That's an 8% improvement. Awesome. Okay, let's add triple pane windows. 4% improvement. Let's improve the walls. Maybe add an inch of insulation on the outside. R20. So that's, again, a 5% improvement. That's not enough. Okay, let's go to R30. That improves it. That's like a double stud wall. Not enough. Let's add R50 in the roof. Let's add insulation in the floor. Okay, 3% improvement. We're not quite getting there. R40 in the foundation wall, still not getting there. Okay, let's just go full passive house envelope. Double stud walls, R40 wall, R80 roof, triple pane fiberglass windows. Best we can do. That's an 11% improvement. Still not getting there. Okay, so let's replace the hot water tank with an air source heat pump hot water tank. So that's a pretty good 15% improvement. Let's add an ERV, which recovers heat from the fresh air. That's a pretty big improvement. Obviously, bringing cold air into your home is always a bad idea. And then an air source heat pump for heating. Finally, we're at our target. Guys, who's excited for the net zero future? This is so easy, right? This is why the building industry is pushing back so hard. They know that this is how hard this is to do this with a passive approach. And again, how practical is this for renovations? It's ridiculous. And what would be the cost of this? 200,000? What's the alternative? Well, let's move that needle from the passive approach to what we call an active approach, where we use the efficiency of mechanical systems to try to do that work for us. So let's leave that concrete floor. Let's leave the walls and roof as is. Let's leave the air tightness. Let's leave the windows. Let's replace the hot water tank with an electric one so we can cut the gas line. And let's add ground source heat pumps. And if you're not familiar, ground source heat pumps are geothermal systems. It's basically where you take advantage of the stable earth temperature. Below the frost line, this earth temperature is basically stable year round. So in Edmonton, it's about 7 degrees year round. And we install a heat exchanger, either vertical or horizontal, and you can also use a pond or an aquifer as a source, but most common is a vertical heat exchanger where we circulate fluid through the ground and we pull heat from the ground in heating and we reject heat into the ground in cooling. So imagine this borehole here. It's a 4 to 6 inch borehole. You stick some plastic pipe with a U-bend at the bottom and you connect those into a header system. So you can imagine the boreholes coming out of this, connecting into this header system, and that goes out into the building heat pump. And so this is, for example, in a parking lot, we had 5 circuits of 7 boreholes. We had 35 boreholes. After that, you can't see anything. It's under the parking lot. If you have room, you can build a horizontal system, but you need a lot of room. But the same concept, this goes back into the building, into the heat pump. And the heat pump is what really does a lot of the work. It looks just like your furnace, so you wouldn't be able to tell. But the heat pump, just like your fridge and air conditioner, works on this refrigeration cycle. The refrigerant inside the heat pump is much different, has much different properties than what you're used to with water. So it can boil at -degree temperatures. So imagine a -4 degree solution of water and antifreeze going into the ground, and it picks up heat from the ground. That in Edmonton is around 7 degrees. As it picks up heat from the ground, it comes back at -1. And this -1, which is the coldest we can use, usually most of the year it's warmer than that, but this -1 is enough to boil this refrigerant. So the refrigerant turns into a vapor, is passed through a compressor. If you know that click in your fridge, that's your compressor kicking in, which increases the pressure and therefore the temperature, and you get a superheated vapor on this side, just 50 or 60 degrees. Now you can pass air or water through that coil and heat up air or water in your home. As the refrigerant gives off heat, it condenses back into a liquid. It's passed through an expansion valve when you rapidly lower the pressure and therefore the temperature, and the cycle starts all over again. And the cool thing with the heat pump is a reversing valve, so you can actually flip between heating and cooling. So instead of rejecting heat to the home, you can reject heat outside, which is exactly how an air conditioner works. That's an air source heat pump. A ground source heat pump, we're using the stable earth temperature and water, which means we can do it much more efficiently. And that's why in heating, we don't care if it's -40 outside. As long as we size the ground properly, we have stable earth temperature. And of course, the cool thing about heat pumps is we're not creating heat, we're moving it. So if we add 1 unit of heat into the compressor, we're moving 3 units of heat from the ground, which means for 1 input, we get 4 out. That's why our efficiency can be 400% on average with a ground source heat pump. Where air source heat pumps, as the temperature drops, as it gets colder, they have less capacity, less efficiency. So they're on average maybe about 200%, obviously depending on your climate. They always have to eventually rely on backup heat because below a certain temperature they won't run, which is 100%. And then you have a high efficiency boiler. This is what we're after, that high efficiency. So again, if we leave everything as is and just add ground source heat pump, comparing that to electric resistance, the energy use, or air source heat pump, you can see the energy use for ground source is a fraction. That's what we're going to use. So where we have our passive approach, where we went from 41 to 12.5 using all that work, just doing these 2 things, we can get to 14.8. No other upgrades. This is starting to look easier, isn't it? And if you really wanted to get to that 13, you could add 1.5 kilowatts of additional solar if you maybe have room on the garage and get to net zero, or you can improve the air tightness, or you can add an ERV, or you can add triple pane windows. You have the flexibility now. This is way easier than this. This is what we call the active approach. And I know this is like very theoretical, so let's use a real world example. My friend was replacing his windows because he had some really old windows on his house. They installed triple pane windows, and then he did some upgrades because the walkout basement had 0 insulation in it, and it was freezing down there. So he added insulation, and he added some insulation in the attic because there was almost none. When they bought the house, they already had a 6 kilowatt solar system. So we wanted to see, like, hey, what can we do with this house? Before the retrofit, he was using between 43 and 39,000 kilowatt hours. So similar to our previous example. Again, 87% of it was gas. So let's take his lowest year, 39, to compare to. After the upgrade, where we added geo and that hot water tank, no other upgrades, we went from the red to the green. We went from 39,000 his lower year to 12,200. 69% reduction in energy use with just those two upgrades. And meanwhile, the utility, Atco Gas, was threatening and sending memos to council saying, if we install electrify systems, each building is going to cost $7,000 a year. Before the retrofit, he was paying about $3,100. After the solar credit, he was paying about $1,400. And his solar only covered about 60%, 65% of his energy use. And he only needed to add 3.5 kilowatts, around 70 grand of solar to get to net zero. Easy. And the whole concept that we're trying to focus on is if blue is your heat demand of your home, with a traditional furnace, your energy use is going to be more than your heat demand because it's a 90% efficient. It's less efficient. So you're going to use more energy than you need. The passive approach tries to reduce the demand and then thinks of the energy as an afterthought, the mechanical system as an afterthought. With the active approach, we still optimize the envelope, which we'll talk about in a second, and then use the efficiency of the geosystem to bring down their energy use. Think of it this way. With a ground source heat pump, if your heat demand is 100, because it's 400% efficient, your energy use is only 25. So if you bring down your heat demand by 50, you didn't reduce your energy use by 50. You reduced it by 50 divided by 4, only 12.5. So each upgrade gives you less and less and less. And so just to illustrate this, we did an analysis on envelope community. This is the energy use on the left. This is the wall R values on the bottom. So we kept everything constant, but we started changing the wall R values. And you can see like a shitty window is like an R2, a good window is maybe R6 or R8. A typical wall for a home is R17. You can see that going from R5 to R10 is a big improvement, 18%. R10 to R15, 9%. But as you keep adding insulation, you're getting less and less for it, right? There's a diminishing return. Meanwhile, the cost keeps going this way. And the reality is when you apply the efficiency of a geosystem, this curve flattens even further because now you divided it by 4 by the efficiency of the geosystem. So you can see past this point, there's almost zero tangible benefit to adding envelope or to improving your envelope. But this is good news. And I'm not saying that envelope isn't important. It's important for thermal comfort and other reasons. But it's great news because we can focus on optimizing the envelope for comfort, for buildability, and cost, while still reaching our net zero targets. We don't need a crazy envelope. And this applies to larger buildings as well. If you think about a multi-story buildings, they're sharing walls, so you really only lose heat through this one thing. So you actually find that the cooling demands for multi-story buildings are way bigger. In this case, you can see the cooling loads are much bigger than the heating loads. We needed 108 boreholes. So the ground temperature is going up over time. So we added the hot water demands to balance out the loads. We reduced our borehole count to 80 boreholes, and now it's a lot flatter. Just by adding geo to this building, we reduced the space heating by 60%, hot water by 75%, and space cooling by 65%. Overall building energy by 35%. A lot of it's still plug loads. And by the way, I don't want to touch on this too quickly because I don't want to talk about finances in a climate emergency, but there is a 30% tax credit now available to commercial properties where you can write off not just the ground loop, but the equipment inside the building and get 30% back, which you can see basically covers, because you can include the equipment and write off the equipment, the heat pumps, you can almost get the entire system paid for. And then on top of that, you can layer in the accelerated capital cost allowance, which allows you to depreciate that asset 50% per year. I don't want to belabor this too much, but there is absolutely business cases for this. Let's quickly look at a commercial example, because does this apply to commercial buildings as well? So this is the Northern Lakes College where we tried to get to net zero. And we, again, looked at a bunch of upgrade options. Option 1, upgrading walls from R20 to R27 with a traditional system was 4 to 7% energy savings. Triple pane windows, around 5 to 8%. For similar cost, Geo, energy savings of 40 to 50%. Upgrades are not built the same. Some have way bigger bang for buck. And what we found is once we picked the Geo system, upgrading walls from R20 to R27, that was a 0.8% energy difference. All of a sudden, the envelope upgrades made 0 sense. And again, actually, the first thing you always need to do is recover heat from your fresh air system. So that's always, ERVs are absolutely crucial with geosystems. So let's look at another commercial building. This was our first attempt at a commercial net zero. And obviously, you try to reduce energy demand first. We reduced lighting loads as much as possible. They used daylighting. We quantified every single piece of equipment in the building. And you need to do that because you need to know where the energy is going. For example, coffee is 3% of this building's energy use. And the kitchen itself, it took more energy than all of the computers in the building. And the commercial buildings are fundamentally different. You have to understand that commercial buildings, they have a lot of heat gains from lighting, from people, and from computers and equipment, especially interior spaces. Those gains stay in the building. There's no way for them to go if they don't have exterior walls. And in a sunny climate like Alberta, solar gains are huge. So commercial buildings are even easier to heat. So the interesting thing is we got some data back from this building in February. They were just partially occupied. This red line shows that it was about minus 12 degrees outside, so freezing. The green line is the temperature coming from the building, or sorry, the green line is the temperature coming from the ground, and the blue line is the temperature going back from the ground, into the ground. So basically, anytime the blue line is above the green line, it means we're rejecting heat to the ground. So the blue is what we're sending to the ground, the green is what's coming back. At minus 12 degrees Celsius, we are cooling the building. As soon as the sun hit that south wall, you can see at the time, we flipped from heating and cooling. This happened the entire week. We're heating at night, cooling during the day. And the building wasn't even fully occupied yet. And so now the internal gains, this building, we're basically cooling down to about minus 15, minus 18 degrees Celsius, which is crazy. Commercial buildings are much more cooling dominant. But this is great news because that means our wall systems actually can be even more basic. What we found is if we improved the wall system too much, we were actually increasing the energy use because we were trapping that heat. So you can still get there with very conventional systems. And we compared trying to get to net zero in our solar PV size with an electric system, an air source heat pump, which was kind of theoretical because it wouldn't have worked for this building or really any commercial building, especially in our climate, and Geo. And you can see because of the efficiency, like all the plug loads and everything below here is the same, but the heating and cooling loads are different. So you need a bigger solar system to offset that energy use. And so there's obviously a cost associated to that. With just electric strip heating, it would have been $900,000 with a solar. With the Geo, it's $300,000 less than that. The cost premium to go to Geo was about $80,000. But you can see the cost difference even in this theoretical air source heat pump scenarios is $130,000 difference. It's always going to be cheaper to install Geo and get to net zero in Geo versus almost any other system because you can reduce your solar costs. And we wouldn't actually have had room on the roof to install solar except with the Geo option because it reduced the demand so much. And so we've had many other projects, some operating 15 years. Geo systems are not new. This is something, there's hundreds of thousands of installs in Canada. And they do perform. This is from one of our buildings in Calgary. This is last year in January, we got to minus 40. We designed for -1. You can see most of the year, the ground loop's operating between 10 and 15 degrees That means the efficiency is around 450, 480%. And on that minus 40-degree day, we got down to about 2 degrees. Our design temperature was -1. It doesn't matter because we have that stable earth temperature. And so the big key takeaway, ground source heat pumps are almost always going to be the easiest and cheapest way to get to net zero. Envelope improvements likely won't make financial sense. I'm not saying they're not important, but they're not going to be the primary driver of energy savings. Ground source heat pumps allow you to optimize the envelope for comfort, buildability, and cost. It gives you way more flexibility. So just talking about some of the advantages, obviously the heating, cooling energy was reduced. You reduce your operating costs, both on an energy standpoint and a maintenance cost standpoint, because there's, that ground loop's going to be there for 200 years. You never have to maintain it. Obviously, they have a longer lifespan. The heat pumps, obviously, in the building, you'll have to replace every 23 to 25 years. They're more comfortable. You don't have a boiler, a chiller. You have a smaller mechanic room. You have no gas main, no gas piping, no gas meter, no gas pollution. And you get that future-proof electric building. Now, obviously, there's some disadvantages. Oftentimes, but not always, you'll have a higher upfront cost. So larger and complex buildings where you have more complex mechanical systems, we found that geosystems actually can be cheaper, for example, with schools. But most of the time, there might be a cost premium. You do require land area, obviously, for retrofits. If you don't have land, you're not going to be able to install it. And it does require more detailed design, truly coordinated design, and detailed energy modeling. Traditional system design is simple. You figure out your hottest day, you calculate your loads on the hottest day with all equipment, all lighting, everything maxed. You get your peak cooling load, and that's your chiller size. In the boiler, you assume there's no people in the building, no lights on, no nothing on your coldest day. That's your peak heating load, and that's your boiler size. As long as you keep paying your gas bill, you keep getting boilers. But the reality is that buildings don't operate that way. That peak load basically never happens. This chart shows for a typical model what percentage of the year here you run at what percent of the peak heating capacity. You can see that 95% of the year you're running at less than a third of the peak heating capacity. Why do we care about this number? And for geodesign, it's not just the peak. We have to know the loads. That's why we do detailed energy modeling, to figure out the loads to size the ground loop properly. And loads matter because we calculate the operation of the geosystem throughout the life of the building. Our client sent us these loads saying, hey, we don't want you to pay you for energy modeling. Can you just run these loads with our loads? Their loads were 663,000 in heating and 23,000 in cooling. Numbers weren't making sense to us when we ran it, so we reran the model. Our heating loads were half of that, and our cooling loads were 10 times that. Compliance models are not realistic energy models. Loads matter. With their design, we would have needed 200 boreholes, and you can see how the ground's going to freeze over time. With our design, we only need 45, and the Earth's temperature is stable. Unfortunately, it does take more careful design. That's the reality. And there's some other opportunities that ground source heat pumps and geosystems present to you. The future is going this way. But some buildings won't be able to. They won't have the room. Their loads will be too big or something like that. But you can connect these systems to ambient loop networks, to district energy networks where you're actually sharing. So for example, let's say you have an ice rink in your community. The typical ice rink rejects about 1.2 million kilowatt hours of heat per year. You pay to freeze the ice, and then you pay to reject the heat from freezing the ice. But that heat can be used in buildings. That 1.2 million kilowatt hours, if we take like a typical duplex, the heating demand, I can heat 90 homes. I can take 90 homes and eliminate 450 boreholes from one ice sheet. And this is true with data centers. Very critical now, all these AI data centers. We're not going to stop them from building it, but maybe we can use the waste heat. Because data centers are another level in terms of waste heat. We can use them as hubs to create district energy networks. Hospitals, grocery stores, we can use sewer heat recovery as waste heat. It doesn't just have to be geosystems. And the whole point is that there's in a network, in a community, there's going to be overlap between your heating and cooling loads, and all of this energy that can be shared. One building can act as a heat source for another. And so I don't want to leave you with all of the negativity I started with at the beginning. So I'm going to leave you with some of the good stuff, sort of. As I mentioned, solar, wind, batteries, EV transition are parabolic. The amount of solar and wind and renewable energy being installed now is insane. And the world is electrifying. Everything is electrifying very rapidly. And I know the fossil fuel industry will scare you saying, well, we'll never be able to replace all of this energy. It's too much. They're lying to you. Remember that we actually only have to replace about 1/3 of it, because 2/3 of all the energy that we currently create is rejected. Think about tar sands, all of the energy, the water, the billions of liters of water, the heat to extract that oil, to process it, to refine it, to ship it to a gas station, to go into your gas tank. When you fill up, only 20% of that fuel is going into driving your car. 80% of it is thrown away as waste heat. But if you use an EV or a heat pump, you don't have that problem. You're 4 to 5 times as efficient, which means we don't have to replace all of that energy. We have to replace only 1/3 of it. And that's why it's a great cycle. Renewables allow us to electrify. Electrification reduces those inefficient fossil fuel sources. So it drives that out, which reduces the amount of clean tech we need to replace fossil fuels, and allows the renewables to actually feed more electrification. That's why fossil fuels are finished. They're dead. And I know the neoliberals in charge right now are banning renewables and putting up a fight to try to stop this from happening. But it is too late. S-curves are going to take over. And the leader of this is China. China is the reason why I'm hopeful. China is leading almost on every single metric. China is ushering us into the renewable energy age. And I know I'm going to need you to ignore a lot of the Western media and the hate that you've heard about China, because China is truly the reason why I'm still hopeful. And just to give you an example, this is Kabuki Base in China. For some reference, the largest solar plant in the US is 579 megawatts, or 579,000 kilowatts. The Mosaic Center, one building, was 220 kilowatts. This is 579,000 kilowatts. So that powers 255 homes. That's the largest in the US. This Kabuki Base in China is 16 gigawatts, or 16,000 megawatts, or 16 million kilowatts. This is one of 225. China last year installed 455 gigawatts of new solar. That could cover all of India's energy use. It single-handedly doubled the world's solar capacity in 1 year. That is the reason. China is the reason why solar energy costs have dropped 98% and why they're projected to drop another 80%. China is the reason why lithium-ion batteries are so cheap now, why EVs are getting cheap, even though they won't let us have them yet. China is leading the adoption of all of these technologies, and why I'm still hopeful. And I have to dig into this a little bit more, but I'm going to give you guys an opportunity here, because I'm going to say some things about the economic system that some of you, depending on how much you listen to Western media, may find new information. You might reject it. So I'm giving you an opportunity to take the blue pill and just take this positivity, and feel free to leave and not hear anymore. But I'm asking you, if you choose to stay and take the red pill, please open your mind to the fact that everything that we've been told by Western media, especially around the West, around China and a lot of these things, has been a lie. So I ask you to open your mind. And I admit I may be wrong. I'm happy to have that conversation. If you do want to leave, I just wanted to remind you that every time you're making a decision, it's a climate decision. and you are making a choice that no human history has ever had to make. You are deciding whether organized human society will survive. If you are staying, I'm sorry, but this is going to get darker. But I think it's important to look at reality because, again, you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Yes, since 2000, renewables have absolutely exploded. We are producing 16 billion megawatt hours more today than the year 2000 of renewables. It's amazing. The problem is that world energy demand grew by 60 billion megawatt hours. 4 times what renewables, mostly driven by an increase in oil, coal, and natural gas. The world has such an insatiable demand for new energy, renewables cannot possibly keep up. They just can't. Think of it this way. If we keep growing at the current rate that we're growing, our economies will double in size by 2050. That means double the energy demand, double the production, double the consumption. So think about how hard we are having a trouble decarbonizing our current economy. We would have to do it twice over again. That means we would have to decarbonize at 14% per year, which is essentially impossible. And we have to remember that renewables aren't just sunshine and roses. There's a real world cost to extracting all the materials that we need for a renewable transition. And there's a real world economic and social and people costs to all of this. Why would we want to make this problem worse? What can we do when we know that endless growth on a finite planet is idiotic? We have to rethink our system. We have to end capitalism before it ends us. And I know for some of you that's going to be, controversial or shocking, or maybe not. I hope it's not. Because it is sometimes easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. We've been told so many lies that we must grow, that GDP must go up, that growth is the key to everything. We have to remember that capitalism is a system that's organized around exchange value, not around use values. The majority of our commodity production is geared towards accumulating profit rather than satisfying human needs. That's why you can buy 40, why is my thing not working? 40 different types of Connor McDavid bobblehead dolls, and you have starving people in the streets. There are huge segments of the economy that are actively and intentionally wasteful and which do not serve any recognizable human purpose, except lining some billionaires' profits. Best example is planned obsolescence. A long time ago, light bulb companies realized that if they make their light bulbs last half as long, they will make double the profits. And it worked like a charm. And we still see that today with iPhones, with fridges, with cars. Planned obsolescence is literally built into these things. They're literally designing these fridges, these washing machines to fail. Think about all the material extraction, all the components, the raw resources, the efforts that it took to create them, and we throw them out because it's too expensive to fix. Capitalism can no more be persuaded to limit growth than a human be persuaded to stop breathing. It's built into the system. Think of it this way. Every natural disaster increases our GDP because we spend more on reconstruction. War and genocide, including our support of the genocide in Gaza. Canada is making money on this genocide. From defense contractors, rebuilding, every environmental disaster increases our GDP because we get contracts for cleanup. And when people get sick, the medical expenses increasing your GDP. High crime increases your GDP through increased police budget, prison spending, insurance claims. Fast fashion, obsolescence. We buy more fridges, we buy more iPhones. Obesity, alcoholism, increased health spending, diet programs, increases your GDP. And these are things that decrease your GDP. Reduced working hours, better work-life balance, lower stress, healthy living, healthy eating, less crime, longer lasting products, phones that can be upgraded, fixed, less pollution, all things that are bad for GDP. Simon Cousins, who invented this metric, said we should never use this as a normal measure of economic progress. Why aren't we tracking human development, human health, social and environmental costs? This metric is useless to us. How can we reconcile the fact that in this rich country, where we're told that we're so lucky, but we can't afford food and shelter, 10% of Canadians live in poverty, half of us die of cancer, 15% of households are food insecure, top 1% holds 25% of the wealth, and the bottom 50 hold just 6%. When our economy is centered around profit, not human well-being, this is what we end up with. And if you just happen to fall through the cracks, if you lose your job or your home, or you have a mental health crisis, you will end up on the streets, and they will let you starve in the streets. Because housing is too expensive, because we're too busy building condos in Toronto, micro condos to sell to investors. Does increasing GDP give you happiness? Does it make our lives better? No. We're slaving away to make profits for a tiny minority. And so, what does the alternative look like? Let's go back and look at China. Because most people don't realize that over the last 40 years, China has eradicated extreme poverty. They've taken 800 million people out of poverty. How did they do that? They had a targeted poverty alleviation program. 1 income, 2 assurances, 3 guarantees. They guarantee minimum annual income, ensure food and clothing, free education, medicine, and safe housing. When you have guarantees, then pivoting away from polluting or harmful industries isn't hard because people's needs are met. I understand the coal miner or the oil sands worker who wants to fight for his job because if he doesn't, he's going to end up in the street. He wants to feed his family. So let's take care of that family. Only the capitalist wins in the scenario where you have to choose between a healthy economy, a healthy ecosystem, and homelessness. If we stopped competing, if we started cooperating, we can do amazing things. Chinese people realize that freedom isn't just putting a checkbox on a ballot between 2 millionaires once every 4 years. Freedom is the freedom to live a dignified life. And this is why China has been investing in people. In 12 years, they built 10,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. Where's our high-speed rail? We haven't built one. China is leading on all of these things. They're so far ahead of us, it's not even funny. And of course, they're not perfect. Of course, they have things to fix. But how can it be that even cities of 30 million people, there's no homeless people, there's no crime, you can walk anywhere. And yes, they have a better democracy than us. And if that shocks you, then I encourage you to maybe check out Upstream Podcast and other resources away from Western media. And they've done this without firing a single bullet. They are not our enemies. And so I imagine a world where I don't pine for the next big bonus or gadget and get distracted by advertising wherever I look. I imagine a quiet evening listening to the birds and insects chirping away in my backyard. In this vision, a lot has changed. High-income countries brought their use of resources, energy down to sustainable levels. We began to take democracy seriously, shared income and wealth more fairly, and put an end to poverty. The gap between rich countries and poor countries shrank. The word billionaire disappeared from our language. Working hours fell from 40 or 50 hours to 20 or 30, giving people more time to focus on family, community, caring, and arts of living. High-quality public healthcare and education were made available to everyone. People came to live longer, happier, more meaningful lives. And we began to think of ourselves differently, as beings interconnected with, rather than separate from the rest of the living world. As for the planet, I imagine the rainforest grew back across the Amazon, the Congo, Indonesia, dense and green and teeming with life. Temperate forests spread again across Europe and Canada. Rivers are clean and cleared, filled with fish. Whole ecosystems recovered. Species that we thought were going to go extinct are thriving. And we accomplished a quick transition to renewable energy. Global temperatures stabilized and weather systems began to heal. And faster than anybody imagined was possible. We took less, but we gained so much more. That is my dream. And it might be the dumb dreams of an idealist, but I refuse to give up. And I hope that you'll join me in this fight. Anyways, that's it. I really encourage you to read Less is More. And if you're curious to dig into some more resources, there's amazing socialist resources on YouTube, Second Thought channel. And I'm happy to, anyways, I'm done. I'm happy to take any questions. I know I covered a lot there.
Sorry, I was on mute. One question from Sarah. Why not more people recommend heat pumps, air source heat pumps in energy audits? Why they don't do it a lot more?
I mean, the reality is that energy audits are often flawed because they're often incremental. You know, replace a boiler with another boiler. Replace this with something slightly better. And this incrementalism is actually a barrier to energy savings, because when you've upgraded something, when you spent money on an upgrade, you're less likely to spend more money. And so people need to change the thought of energy audits with this context in mind, that the future is going to be different. If you're installing a boiler and replacing it with another boiler, that's a stranded asset. You just wasted their money. And so everything has to be on the path to net zero. And I think that's why it's just the whole energy audits oftentimes are just a checkbox for a lot of companies, and you know, they're just trying to show that they're doing something. Maybe that's a cynical reply, but
There was we're going a little bit over time here, but also a question. So if you talk about air source ground source heat pumps, there's a lot of heat pump technologies available for the moment, like air source heat pumps, CO2 heat pumps, ground source heat pumps. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because if you don't have the space
yeah, for sure.
like
So
in a city, for example.
there's mostly air source heat pump and ground source heat pump. Obviously, there's CO2 based refrigerants that are better at high temperatures, but it depends where you are. If you're in Vancouver or Victoria, an air source heat pump might make sense for you. If you're in a cold, warmer climate, air source heat pumps might be okay. In Edmonton, in a really cold climate, air source heat pumps are tough to recommend. The failure rates are high. They're exposed to the freezing rain, the snow, the hail, the compressors outside. The manufacturers don't publish the defrost cycle and that its impact on COP. So every COP, every efficiency that you see should be derated by 0.6 to 0.9 COP, because they don't account for defrost cycle. And eventually, you get less capacity, you get less efficiency, and then they stop working. So you have to rely on backup heating. And you have to keep thinking about, one, what are your peak demands? And your utilities are going to be based on your peak charges. So we've just analyzed it for a fire station. Just going with air source heat pumps on a fire station, just the peak charges alone were going to be like $30,000 a year, just because your peaks are so high in those cold winter days. And you have to think about the grid. Our grid cannot handle a mass deployment of air source heat pumps. Utilities should be funding ground source heat pumps because they reduce the investment that they have to make in grid infrastructure. Because again, those peaks. So I would say air source heat pumps have their place in warmer climate, and in places where you just don't have an option, you don't have space or something like that. But I'm a big believer in ground source heat pump because yes, it's more expensive, but you know what? You pay for it. It's more efficient. It lasts forever. It's lower maintenance. It's more comfortable. you know?
We'll see some people still in the audience. So, question from Edwin: do hybrid systems of geo and gas boilers ever make sense?
I mean, so we do install hybrid systems. Not that we don't want to decarbonize everything, but the reality is that some buildings, especially buildings like high rises, you don't have enough capacity. You don't have enough space in the ground because these envelopes are so bad. The buildings are so inefficient that you simply have to rely sometimes on backup heating. But for lower density buildings, like we usually try to go full geo, and a lot of our buildings are, you can obviously in very extreme climates where you have really high peaks, sometimes you can really reduce the cost of the geo system by adding a hybrid system to cover those 4 or 5 days a year that are really cold. You can actually reduce your the ground loop size quite a bit. But it obviously depends on the situation. But yes, we have hybrid systems as well.
Then another question from Edwin. Thank you for all your questions, by the way. How is the approach retrofits where ventilation heat recovery is not feasible?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know the specifics, but the reason we always want to see energy recovery on the fresh air system with a geosystem, because like the Mosaic Center, adding heat recovery to that system dropped the size of the geosystem by half, just half the boreholes. Because if you think about it, when you have a lot of fresh air demands, you're bringing in minus 30-degree air. That's the biggest heating demand you're going to have. It can be 50% of your heating demand. Of course, when we put ERVs that are 90% efficient, you can reduce your heating demands hugely. That air is coming in at 13 degrees instead of minus 30. So for me, it's necessary, and I would push back if they say, why is it not possible? I mean, I don't know specific cases, but push back. Sometimes you'll find that very traditional engineers will keep pushing old solutions.
Then a good question from Benjamin, actually. What's the cost comparison between passive envelope improvement and the active geosystem for a single family house you shared?
I mean, so again,
The big lines, right? The big lines.
Yeah, like, I mean, I was trying to illustrate every case is going to be different because it depends on your home and your windows and what the quality is, what's your envelope, what's your air tightness. I would generally say it's always going to be probably less than half the cost to focus one on air tightness for a home. If you need new windows, replace the windows. Those impact thermal comfort a lot. After that, geo will most likely get you close to net zero. And these days, like, geo might not be cheap either, right? Depending on the contractors in your area. But it's certainly going to be less than all of those upgrades, which practically may not even be possible to do.
Mm-hmm. And so these were the questions in the chat. There was also a lot of stuff happening. So we'll check at the last thing. Question from Saurav. Any funding programs available for nonprofits looking to install ground source heat pumps?
So I don't know where you are, but
Alberta.
yeah, not that I know of, unfortunately. There used to be, ERA had a short stint where they were actually funding geosystems, but not really. They're too busy, subsidizing pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that I know is, like I highlighted in my slides, everybody is talking about energy efficiencies and create energy efficiencies, so paybacks based on energy efficiencies. But if you look at operational efficiencies, your numbers look completely different. So if you have more data of your building, so the slide that Jacob showed is if you have 100% of your 100%, and then you need a quarter. So every time you bring it down and down and down, so you basically create less operation, you create increase your operational efficiencies, and your payback looks completely different than just looking at from an energy point of view. So we say create your own incentives. So if you have more data, lower insurance premiums, low risks, um, better maintenance, because all that is not put in the equation in a standard energy audit. And if you look at it, whole building, that changes a lot. So wondering if targets can be achieved with 3 inches of stucco system, and how your vapor management will be controlled.
I mean, so without getting to too much details, I'm building a net zero home, and my walls are 23 effective. Nothing crazy, not much better than code. Our roof is R30 something. I have good windows because I want thermal comfort. It's not hard. Geo makes it really easy to get to net zero. I wouldn't overthink the envelope.
Yeah. So here, question from Colleen: how do municipalities react to ground source heat pumps for houses? Are permits easy to obtain?
Yeah, they're super easy to get. Most
Yeah.
municipalities aren't really sophisticated enough, so they have like very basic permits, and they don't even know how to check them. They don't check for them. So even if you didn't have a permit, they probably wouldn't even know. Yeah, that might change in the future, but right now it's a little bit of the Wild West.
Yeah.
Which is not a good thing, by the way, but
there's still a lot in the chat here. I don't know if I can cover everything. There's a lot of questions about combining the air source heat pump with the ERV, but you covered that because the ERV will reduce the boreholes and the amount of capacity you need. Yeah, let me check. I think that's almost everything. That's everything, yeah. I would say that's it for now.
okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the audience. Thank you, Jacob, for presenting today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out.
Bye.
I didn't put the contact slide up, but
I put it up.
okay.